churches, things like that. But I missed the liturgy of the body. I missed bringing my body into prayer, the kneeling, the standing, the sitting, that rhythm of worship with the body, which I didn't have a language for saying that at the time.
That's what I was wondering. There was something missing.
There was something missing, and I couldn't put my finger on it. I just kind of thought Protestants didn't know how to pray. I was like, they're really good at the spontaneous prayer, but when it comes to church, you just go to church and you sing some songs and you sit down, you listen to a good homily. I was like, that's a lecture series. That's not, you're not worshiping the Lord. So that deep sense of liturgy that had been put into me as a child, you can take the girl out of the church, but you can't take the church out of the girl. I really missed the Catholic Mass. I didn't understand what the Catholic Mass was. I didn't understand what the Eucharist was. I just knew I missed it. And then one night I was at a Bible study, and one of the women who had been discipling me brought up, she goes, well, I think maybe next week we should, have Holy Communion during our study. And I was like, you can't have Holy Communion during your study. What are you talking about? And she was like, well, of course we can. And she was trying to explain, and again, I didn't have the language to explain why I thought that was wrong, but I just knew a bunch of ordinary people sitting around their living room couldn't just make the Eucharist appear. I was like, I don't understand how this is possible. So I was wrestling with these issues internally. And by this point, I'd left doing the missionary work. I was still, all my friends were in the fellowship. That's who I spent my time with. And I'd gone to work at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C. And I was there, and they hired Rob Corzine, who you know. He is now he's the executive vice president of Scott Hahn's, the St. Paul Center. But at that time, he was my assistant. So he was brought in to kind of help Ed Meese, who we were both working for at the time. And Rob was really Catholic. Rob was a convert himself. He had converted from being a Baptist. And I had never met anyone like him before, because he was obviously a Christian. I mean, he talked about Jesus, he loved Jesus, but he was also into bishops and liturgical vestments. And I was like, why is any of this necessary? And I did my whole fellowship line on him. I'm like, Jesus just wants us to love him, and he wants us to serve him, and all that extra stuff is add-ons. And Rob, who really knew his stuff because he converted from being a Baptist, started challenging me on those things. And again, when I had left the church 6 years earlier, I didn't know what questions to ask. I had never been given the Catholic faith. I left, of course I left, because there was nothing there in terms of what I had been given. So Rob started talking to me about Catholicism, and I'm thinking, I never heard this stuff growing up. Like, why didn't anyone explain this to me? It was a whole different way of even thinking about the church. And Rob he still likes to joke that he would talk to me one day about something, like the church's teachings on contraception. And because I'm a redhead, and I like to argue back, I would just argue with him and explain why, that's so silly, that's so outdated, this is you don't have to be against contraception. But then when I would leave, I would actually think about what he had to say, because there was no argument for me to win. And I'm like, actually that makes a lot of sense. And I would change my mind, but never tell him that I had changed my mind. Until maybe a month later, he would say something. I'd be like, I know, I agree with you on that now. And he'd be like, what? Could you at least tell me when I win an argument? So at that point, Rob realized, okay, I think Emily is ready to start thinking seriously about Catholicism. And he gave me a G.K. Chesterton book to start with, The Poet and the Lunatic, which was one of G.K. Chesterton's works of fiction. But he knew that I was very susceptible to the poetic and the beautiful. And he thought if he gave me a Chesterton book that really captured my imagination, I would want to read more G.K. Chesterton, and that he could give me things that were a little more meaty. So that worked. I loved the G.K. Chesterton book. The next book he gave me was the sequel to A Severe Mercy. As a Protestant, I'd read Sheldon Van Auken's conversion story, which talks about his time at Oxford and his relationship with his wife, and how C.S. Lewis brought them to Christianity. Very popular book with evangelicals at the time. It's a beautiful, tragic love story, so what young woman wouldn't be, captive? I loved that book. But I never knew that Sheldon Van Auken became Catholic. And so when I'm reading the continuation to A Severe Mercy, I'm discovering this. I'm like, this is someone who was really smart and really loved Jesus and knew C.S. Lewis. Wait, someone who knew C.S. Lewis and had talked with him became Catholic. I don't understand this. So The next thing Rob did was I think he gave me a Frank Sheet book. And I was reading that over Thanksgiving break. So a month before, Rob had needed to go to All Saints Mass at a conference that we had. And I was like, oh, you're so silly. You don't have to go. Holy Days of Obligation. You're just following all these man-made rules. Over the next month, I was reading. By December 8th, which is the next holy day of obligation of the Catholic Church, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, I had gone to confession and I was attending daily Mass. It was the easiest. There was no angst. There was no stress. It was like, oh, well, this is obviously true. So I'm going to confession and I'm going to be Catholic again. Now, there was lots of reading that had to follow, and there's lots of reasons, I think, looking back, why I was able to make that switch so fast. There's so many obstacles to conversion.
Right.
The first one is just embedded situations in our life for sin. So if you're divorced and remarried, there's that question, do I have to get annulment, and what kind of situation is that going to put up? If you're living with your boyfriend and using contraception, I'm really going to have to change my life if I say this is true. I don't want to change my life. And so that's an obstacle to conversion. And then there's obstacles to conversion like C.S. Lewis. He was an Ulster Protestant. Anti-Catholicism was so deeply ingrained in him. And even though his theology became more and more Catholic throughout his life, he just couldn't get past the anti-Catholicism of his youth. I didn't have any of those obstacles. I wasn't divorced and remarried. I wasn't living with my boyfriend. I didn't have any great ingrained prejudice against the church, and my family certainly wanted me to stop being an evangelical and come back home. They didn't fully understand what that meant, because they still didn't fully grasp the faith. They were still struggling in their own ways, but they wanted me to become Catholic. So it was very easy for me to make that decision. So I made it without even fully understanding, why I'd done it. Probably the primary reason was, I knew Jesus was real. I loved Jesus. I had spent years following Jesus. We had a relationship. I talked with him like he was, sometimes I think he probably would have liked me to be quiet. So I had this deep sense of love for Jesus. There was no question about that. But Rob raised the question, well, and what I had said earlier, how do you know about Jesus? How do you know that what he said is true? And I was like, well, the Bible. And he was like, well, where do you think the Bible came from? And I'm like, well, the apostles wrote it. And he's like, well, who transcribed it? Who kept transcribing it? Who translated? Who handed it down? Who preserved it from the Vandal hordes, when they were charging the gates? I was like, oh, a good question. Obviously, the answer was the Catholic Church. So logically speaking, looking at the question, I was like, well, if the church was going to all this trouble to handwrite it out page by page and protecting it and handing it down, why would they be doing that if there was all sorts of stuff in the Bible that contradicted them? I mean, they would be leaving that out, surely. Or they'd be burning in the Bible and be like, no, we have the authority. You don't need the Bible. But they didn't. It was sacred. They took that responsibility of transmitting every word faithfully. So I was like, oh, well, then obviously, if I think something I'm reading in the Bible contradicts what the church is saying, then I'm reading it wrong. So they have to know more about this than I do. So that was the primary, once that was decided, as a 19-year-old, I had decided who Jesus was. He was Lord, liar, or lunatic, and I decided he was the Lord. So now, as a 25-year-old, I needed to decide who the church was. Was she some harlot, or was she the bride of Christ? And the only logical conclusion I could come up with that she was the bride of Christ. So after that, it was up for me to learn the rest. And,
Why don't we pause,
Yeah.
take a break there,
Okay.
because I have some questions about the rest that you had to pick up
Great.
on, as well as what stuck out with me as you're telling your story, was that when your friends wanted you to do the Lord's Supper, you knew that, you believed that it really was the body and blood of our Lord. The seed was planted there, and you knew you guys couldn't do that.
Yeah.
I want to talk about that when we get back, the reality of that seed that was in you that grew later as you came back. So we'll pause right there.
And so then, in typical Emily fashion, I spent the entire month of January 2001 reading the Catechism cover to cover. So that's what I did. I said, well, I was not given the faith as a child, so I need to learn the faith now, and there's this great big book of it. So
Right.
I'm going to sit down and read the catechism, and that's what I did from January to probably February, which was fantastic.
Yeah.
Next book I read, so Rob, of course, is still in the background, and he's like, oh, look, I got a ripe one here. She's taking every book I can throw at her. So Frank Sheed's Theology and Sanity was the next book I read after the catechism, and that was the most fantastic book because it gave me a Christology, it helped me understand Trinitarian theology, it helped me understand the whole theology of the church, what we would say is ecclesiology. And even to this day, I can get all of my questions about Jesus's, is he a human person or a divine person? I can get those right thanks to Frank Sheed. I often say he gave me the grammar of Catholicism. If Catholicism were a sentence you could diagram, he taught me how to do that. And that was really foundational. Chesterton did the same, but he gave me the poetry of Catholicism. He showed me the beauty and the enchantment in the world. And I responded, that's what made sense to me. My Protestant reading had said the world is a horrible, fallen place. It's completely corrupted by sin, bad, bad, bad. And I'm looking at the world around me, and I was like, but look at that sunset. Like, does that not say God is glorious? Look at the mountain. It says God is not moving. Look at the ocean. It says God is infinite. I'm like, this whole world, there's beauty in it. It's an enchanted world, even though there's sin in it. And G.K. Chesterton said that in a much more beautiful way than I could. So reading Chesterton, I just relearned the poetry of Catholicism. Learned it for the first time in many ways because I hadn't been given it as a child.
One of the hardest things I